Man, that's a lot of orals. Oh, and then whatever steroids and SARMs you're putting on top. That's 10 orals. You can make it work, to a certain extent, but not that I agree with a practice like this, but this is 10 orals. Vigorous Steve here. So you want to do an orals only cycle. Man, I don't really know what to say, so let me give you a visual demonstration instead. I need you to tilt your head a little bit more. Okay, that's good. Hold it there. I'm going to connect the back of my hand, this area right here, with your ears, cheek, and jaw. About an inch behind at very high velocity. Feel free to close your eyes. I doubt you'll see it coming, but feel free to close your eyes. Are you ready? Okay, here it comes. Good. Now that I got your attention, let me explain to you why an orals only cycle is not a good idea, but I will offer my solutions at the end of this video, so feel free to skip ahead using the timestamps. Now, what we mean with an orals only cycle, we probably mean the Anabolic-Androgenic steroids or selective androgen receptor modulators in tablet form. So we can bypass injections altogether, right? You just take the tablets and you call it a day. But unfortunately, it's not as simple as that, because most of the anabolics, whether those are steroids or non-steroidal SARMs, and even steroidal SARMs, most of them cause, or basically all of them cause Hypothalamic-Pituitary-Testes-Axis downregulation, to the point your testicles are no longer producing testosterone and estrogen as well. Now, the testosterone and estradiol won't bottom out completely. They'll be subclinical, but they won't be zero, because the adrenal glands produce Neuro-Steroids which cascade into testosterone and estradiol. And the Hypothalamic-Pituitary-Testes-Axis downregulates, inhibiting testosterone and estradiol production in the testes, but the Neuro-Steroid production in the adrenal glands usually continues to a certain extent. And DHEA converts into testosterone, which cascades into estradiol as well. But serum concentrations will never be sufficient, because the HPTA is completely downregulated in the presence of exogenous anabolic-androgenic steroids or selective androgen receptor modulators, and the HPAA, the hypothalamic-pituitary-adrenal axis, is suppressed to the point that DHEA and pregnenolone concentrations in the bloodstream are somewhere towards the bottom middle of the reference range. Which, you'll get a little bit of testosterone and estradiol from that, but it will always be subclinical. And now you're missing out on all the physiological functions that testosterone and estradiol regulate. Testosterone provides the anabolism, and estradiol provides anabolism on top of that, albeit to a much lower extent compared to the testosterone. Estradiol mediates so many physiological functions that have to do with health, like favorable lipid concentrations or neuroprotection, or helps to regulate blood pressure or collagen synthesis. Hair growth. Guys, estradiol and testosterone are pretty much essential, and by taking exogenous AAS or SARMs, you're missing out on the test and the estradiol. So ideally, you at least administer 100 milligrams of exogenous testosterone per week when you decide to go with orals. But again, you probably don't want to inject. You don't want all this invasive methods and creating scar tissue and, joining the rest of the men. You want to, do an oral only cycle and, go with convenience. Well, those are the risks. Testosterone will decline, estradiol will decline to subclinical levels, and you're missing out. Your health will slowly decline, and your libido will decline with it. So let's go over the list of all the anabolic-androgenic steroids which are going to shut down Hypothalamic-Pituitary-Testes-Axis. We'll start at the top with Anavar, and Anadrol, and Andriol, which is testosterone undecanoate. But again, testosterone undecanoate tablets might be able to fulfill some of the physiological functions of testosterone and estradiol, given that the dose is sufficient. So there might be something to say for testosterone undecanoate. Again, it's a lot of extra burden on the liver. Dianabol, halotestin, primobolan acetate, Proviron. There might be something to say for Proviron. We'll discuss that a little bit later in this video. Superdrol, Turinabol, Winstrol, and all the obscure oral anabolic steroids like methyl-1-trenbolone or metribolone or check drops. All of those steroids will shut you down to a certain extent. Now, testosterone undecanoate, again, is used only in the cases of hormone replacement. And I've heard some anecdotal evidence that Proviron is able to lower sex hormone binding globulin concentrations, but not luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. Again, this is anecdotal evidence, and I've never seen the blood work, but I've heard stories from guys that just do Proviron monotherapy. They're a little bit older. Their sex hormone binding globulin is perhaps a little bit high, and their body fat levels are also a little bit too high. They have, basically the opposite of fundamental understanding of hormonization. So they just take the Proviron and say they feel better. Maybe that's the reduction in the sex hormone binding globulin, or preventing excess aromatization of testosterone into estradiol, and then they've got a favorable ratio between the test and the estradiol. And they continue like that for maybe years on end. Personally, I've never seen the blood work, but anecdotal evidence, we can't disregard it. So if you're one of the guys that ever did Proviron monotherapy, please email me your blood work. I would love to see what it looks like, and if LH and FSH levels are somewhat in the middle of the range, indicating that there's no HPTA downregulation. Now, some of the steroid-like compounds, again, you can take DHEA and pregnenolone exogenously. There might be something to say for that in cases where your DHEA and pregnenolone concentrations are low due to old age, right? And then it will cascade into, maybe sufficient amounts of testosterone or estradiol downstream. Again, the pregnenolone will convert into progesterone and downstream cortisol and aldosterone. So again, you have to be careful with your dosing, because even if you go super physiological with the DHEA, there will be a negative feedback loop because testosterone and estradiol is too high, downregulating the LH and FSH secretion from the pituitary gland. Finasteride and dutasteride, non-anabolics, steroid-like compounds, act as a 5-alpha reductase inhibitor, preventing or reducing the conversion of testosterone into dihydrotestosterone. Again, they're steroid-like compounds, and so are the aromacin or the arimistane. They're aromatase inhibitors, steroid-like compounds that get lodged in the aromatase enzyme and act as a suicide inhibitor. They get lodged in the aromatase enzyme. That particular aromatase enzyme is no longer able to convert other testosterone or other compounds into estradiol or methyl-estradiol or another estradiol metabolite. So those aromatase inhibitors are suicidal and render aromatase enzymes inactive. Steroid-like molecules without any anabolic properties. Aldactone, actually an anti-androgen. You might be able to raise serum concentrations of testosterone in the bloodstream by blocking the androgen receptor on, metabolically active tissue that's susceptible to testosterone or that responds to testosterone binding. So serum concentrations in the bloodstream might go up, but the overall androgen effectiveness will go down because you're blocking the androgen receptor, because aldosterone is taking the place of testosterone or other androgens, like dihydrotestosterone, for example. So these are steroid-like, but they don't really hold any anabolic benefits unless it's the DHEA, which converts into testosterone and estradiol, which again, hold anabolic benefits. Now, there are non-steroidal selective androgen receptor modulators, and we'll go through this list quite quickly because I don't have so much experience with it, but all the blood work that I've seen on these compounds show HPTA shutdown. And if you're one of the guys that says you don't have any HPTA shutdown, please email me your blood work with your LH, FSH, and the protocol of SARMs that you were running. The non-steroidal SARMs, BMS 564929. I don't think it's very common, but I saw it on the list, so I'll have to mention it here. There's a couple LGD varieties. You have the LGD 2226, 3303, and the one that we commonly use in this fitness space is Ligandrol with the number LGD 4033. I've seen, blood work, HPTA downregulation, 0 test or low test and low estradiol. Same with ostarine. Same with RAD140. Same with S4 androgen. And there's another number of S4. I can't remember what it stands for. S4029, whatever the number might be. Also didn't pass clinical trials. I haven't seen anybody talk about it. So there's another S4 with a couple extra numbers behind it. And then there's S23, also causes HPTA downregulation. And then there's 2 steroidal SARMs, and I believe that Trenbolone is classified as a steroidal SARM as well. TMF4AS1, which acts as a selective androgen receptor modulator, but might also act as a 5-alpha reductase inhibitor. I never really hear anybody talk about TFM4AS1, but, in the limited research that I've done, it might hold a little bit of promise for the guys that suffer from hair loss. So you might be able to replace the anabolism of testosterone and reduce your DHT concentrations to really 0, because, again, TFM4AS1 is probably going to downregulate HPTA production as well. Serum concentrations of testosterone decline, acts as a 5-alpha reductase inhibitor. DHT concentrations are going to decline to basically 0 or very, very low, because there's not too much testosterone to convert, and you're blocking the conversion. And then whatever anabolic pathway you might be able to fulfill with the TFM4AS1 might be beneficial. Again, the guys that suffer from hair loss go through extreme lengths sometime. Nandrolone only. Maybe you can do a TFM4AS1 SARM cycle instead. Again, the research is limited. I'm just going by what I read in a 30-minute research. So, additional research is probably required. Another steroidal SARM is YK11. I've seen the blood work, HPTA downregulation. So, from all these orals that we can choose from, you can run them, but you're missing out on the physiological functions of testosterone and estradiol, which is a shame, but there are ways around it. This video wouldn't be complete without some alternatives, right? There's a couple other anabolics which don't cause HPTA downregulation. One of them being Clenbuterol. It's even listed on the WADA doping list under anabolic agents. Clenbuterol acts on the beta-2 adrenergic receptors, causes central nervous system stimulation, induces fat loss, and results in a slight anabolic benefit. I see that women benefit from Clenbuterol when it comes to anabolism more than men, because women generally don't have so much muscle tissue. And, the additional anabolism that they might get from estradiol or progesterone, which are, elevated compared to men. Their testosterone concentrations are generally much lower, but their estradiol and progesterone concentrations are generally higher. You see that the women get a much better anabolic benefit from Clenbuterol alone. That's why I always feel that Clenbuterol is a reasonably safe compound for women, because there's no virilization and no HPTA downregulation. Another compound that we now have the evidence for is turkesterone, which shows that it doesn't cause any HPTA downregulation as well. It can't replace testosterone, obviously, because turkesterone potentiates anabolism to the estrogen beta receptor pathway. But it is of note that of all the steroid-like molecules, even though turkesterone is a steroid coming from plants and the ecdysteroids are basically steroids coming from invertebrates, all these steroid-like molecules or cholesterol derivatives, the ecdysteroids and turkesterone is able to potentiate anabolism without HPTA downregulation. So that might be the only anabolic oral you can take safely. Another oral which could contribute to overall anabolism is MK677. The problem is because MK677 stimulates the ghrelin receptors and boosts appetite, it might cascade into insulin resistance by keeping growth hormone concentrations marginally elevated throughout the day. Again, MK677 is a growth hormone secretagogue. You would still need to check your blood glucose concentrations frequently. And if you're doing an oral-only cycle to bypass any kind of injection or invasive method to analyze your blood. Again, you have to get the blood from somewhere, and you could throw a temper tantrum and you get yourself a nosebleed and then analyze that in your glucometer. It's probably not very practical, so you need to use the lens and check that with your AccuCheck or whatever glucometer you use to check your serum glucose concentrations, because in many cases, prolonged use of MK677 leads to insulin resistance, and then fasting glucose concentrations start to rise and rise and rise to the point they're not fasted glucose concentrations, but postprandial glucose concentrations at 130 milligrams per deciliter, which in reality fasted glucose concentration should be below 100 milligrams per deciliter. I've seen that before, and the only way to really measure that is by pricking your finger and analyzing your blood. Might be a way around it though. A bit of caloric restriction, not overdoing the carbohydrates. And even though serum growth hormone concentrations are elevated, you're not in this glycogen saturated state. And then, of course, you might be able to combine the MK677 with berberine or metformin before bed, even though you're kind of reducing serum IGF-1 concentrations, or you're defeating part of the anabolic pathway. But you might be able to keep insulin sensitivity and fasted glucose concentrations intact. But it's a combination of MK677 with metformin before bed or with berberine instead. And I would go with the berberine because it doesn't lower IGF-1 concentrations as much as the metformin does. So the Clenbuterol, the Turkesterone, and the MK677 yields a decent amount of anabolic benefit without HPTA downregulation. And then you have the GW1516 or SR9009, which preferentially burn fat over glycogen stores or intraskeletal muscle protein stores. And you might be able to mitigate some catabolism that way. Again, I haven't really seen any studies or true evidence that GW1516 or SR9009 is able to prevent atrophy. But again, in this cocktail, everything counts. So it's worth mentioning here. And then the last one, which can actually boost your HPTA, is Clomid or Enclomiphene. And it's actually used in, androgen deficiency states. Clomid monotherapy is able to raise serum LH and FSH concentrations. And I believe it's the same for Enclomiphene, although, it's not generally prescribed. Usually they go with Clomid, even though the side effects are way more severe. And, Enclomiphene is actually more selective. And, you could probably get by with a slightly lower dose. And I believe that the side effects are less severe than Clomid as well. So ideally, you go with Enclomiphene if you can source it. And that will raise serum LH and FSH concentrations to the point HPTA function is better or maybe maintained while you're running oral Anabolic-Androgenic steroids or selective androgen receptor modulators. So you might have to do Clomid in combination with the oral steroids or SARMs in order to prevent HPTA downregulation. Again, you have to outweigh the mental side effects and the potential for ocular changes to, the small invasive method of administering exogenous testosterone by itself. You have to outweigh that, but it's an oral only cycle and we have to, compose it somehow with the parameters that we're given, right? So there's something to say for Clomid, allowing for HPTA to not downregulate because Clomid or Enclomiphene is blocking the estrogen receptors in the hypothalamus and the pituitary, preventing downregulation. So testosterone estradiol concentrations should be sustained on exogenous steroids or SARMs. But Clomid also promotes sex hormone binding globulin, or Enclomiphene also promotes sex hormone binding globulin production in the liver by acting as an estrogen. So you're blocking the estrogen receptors in the hypothalamus and the pituitary, and you're promoting estrogen-like effects in the liver. Sex hormone binding globulin is going up. Something to say for Proviron now, right? Lowest effective dose, 12.5 milligrams to maybe 25 milligrams of Proviron per day. Again, you're preventing HPTA downregulation with maybe 25 milligrams of Clomid per day or 25 milligrams of Enclomiphene per day. And now you want to bring that sex-hormone binding globulin to favorable concentrations with 12.5 milligrams to 25 milligrams of Proviron, allowing for more free testosterone. And perhaps a little bit of anti-estrogenic effect, because Proviron can also reversely bind to the aromatase enzyme and temporarily block the conversion of testosterone into estradiol. Now, again, I haven't seen blood work on Proviron monotherapy, so that's usually in combination with testosterone, exogenous testosterone, or other compounds that convert or potentiate some anti-estrogenic effects, like primobolan or masterone, right? They also reversely bind to the aromatase enzyme and temporarily block the conversion of testosterone into estradiol and Proviron compounds. So I've seen blood work on testosterone with Proviron. Free T goes up, but estrogen stays pretty comparable, maybe a little bit lower. And again, more free T, more free testosterone means more potential for that free testosterone to convert into estradiol. So even though you're blocking some of the aromatase enzymes temporarily with Proviron, and you're definitely blocking the sex-hormone binding globulin from, binding testosterone, I think it balances itself out. The increased amount of free testosterone and, reducing some of the conversion, but there's still more potential for conversion. So in most cases, the estrogen kind of balances itself out, and we are simply adding in the Proviron to lower sex-hormone binding globulin and freeing up testosterone, for an increased libido. Again, because Clomid is producing more sex-hormone binding globulin. Also keeping those lipids favorable. So a little bit of estradiol reduction might be, warranted. And you can lower the estradiol even further with an aromatase inhibitor, preventing the conversion of testosterone into estradiol with a very low dose of aromasin. And again, it highly depends on your blood work how much aromasin you might use to prevent the conversion of testosterone into estradiol, but I would say a low dose of 6.25 milligrams of aromasin twice per week is probably sufficient to raise free testosterone concentrations and lower serum estradiol concentrations to favorable levels. And you would probably get the same effect from incorporating 200 milligrams of diindolmethane per day, which is also an oral. And for the guys that don't know, diindolmethane promotes the conversion of estradiol into less active, less potent estrone or estriol. So now your serum estradiol concentrations get lower, less negative effect on HPTA downregulation through the estrogen receptor pathway. Again, you're blocking that with clomiphene or Clomid Enclomiphene, so it's not really something you have to worry about. But again, we're trying to optimize the testosterone concentrations, and get the rest of the anabolism from the exogenous steroids or SARMs. You might be able to raise testosterone to somewhat favorable levels, but by lowering the estradiol, you're missing out on the anabolism, and you might be able to replace that with turkesterone. Man, how many orals are we on? 25 milligrams of Clomid, 12.5 to 25 milligrams of Proviron. Clenbuterol, forgot to mention that, but hey, 20 to 40 micrograms of Clenbuterol per day, 20 to 30 milligrams of MK677 before bed, and 500 milligrams of berberine. 5 orals already, and we didn't even get to the 5-alpha reductase inhibitor. And we can use, a low dose of finasteride and a low dose of aromasin to prevent the conversion of testosterone into estradiol or DHT, raising testosterone concentrations further. Maybe diindolmethane instead of the aromatase inhibitor. So we'll keep that at 1 point because you'll have to choose one or the other. And then we have turkesterone on top of all of this to provide additional anabolism through the estrogen beta receptor pathway. Man, that's a lot of orals. Oh, and then whatever steroids and SARMs you're putting on top. That's 10 orals. You can make it work, to a certain extent, but not that I agree with a practice like this, but this is 10 orals to get the same as going on a hormone replacement of testosterone, microdosing it to get favorable estradiol concentrations, maybe 25 milligrams per day or 15 milligrams per day, or whatever practice you need to do to get your estradiol concentrations favorable. And then you throw in an anabolic androgenic steroid of your choice on top. Hopefully it's Anavar. a low dose of Anavar, hormone replacement testosterone, a couple injections per week, and man, you might even be able to get by with like 100 milligrams of test per week, one invasive method per week. Use a little bit of the Anavar to get or to prevent aromatization, because again, you know, Anavar is a DHT derivative. It will reversely bind to the aromatase enzyme and prevent a little bit of the conversion of testosterone into estradiol. So you might be able to get away with that. One invasive method per week, one oral steroid on top, and get a very good result. That would be my method of choice. And again, if you want to do something comparable without the invasive method, 10 freaking orals. 10. Is it worth it? Probably not. Well, I really hope this deters you from doing an oral-only cycle. I hope I offered a solution in the process. Either way, thank you for watching. If you're looking for the most comprehensive guides to bodybuilding pharmacology, you can find the ebooks on my website, vigoroussteve.com/shop. If you're looking for personalized advice, you can find the rates to my services in the services section. Follow me on Instagram @VigorousSteve. And for the Vigorous crew, you guys know what to do. And remember, that bitch slap was not for you, because the Vigorous crew is way too smart to do an orals only cycle. You guys get the front double bicep, no bitch slaps served. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.